In today's episode of Becoming Secure with Mike's Mindset, I am talking to Willie. And to introduce Willie, I am going to read a few quotes from his own blog. I am a child of Holocaust survivors. I had traumatized parents who were left stateless and penniless after World War II. With almost no extended family, I live in a world filled with ghosts. In fact, I live in two worlds, in the present-day Canada and sometimes back in the Holocaust. Traveling between these two worlds is like going from day to night, from summer to winter, from freedom to prison. Too often, it leaves me feeling adrift. I never spoke to anyone about how I felt. I held it inside, but over time I realized that other children of Holocaust survivors felt the same way. How are we different? We are high risk for experiencing depression, anxiety, and PTSD through exposure to our traumatized parents. We have few or no role models, as many of us have no grandparents, aunts, and uncles. This leads to rocky relationship with siblings and estrangement. We have a strange connection with family history. It's typically unknown, which creates a strong need to establish a family legacy. We are often hypersensitive to threats and duplicating our parents' fight and flight, freeze, and fawn responses. Not surprising, we respond strongly to anti-Semitism, and often we are ready to fight back for fear of making the same mistakes as European Jewry during the 1930s. We are also much more susceptible to stressful events. Without any further ado, I wish to welcome Willie to my podcast. Enjoy today's episode. I was really intrigued by your story. Just by reading the first sentences, when you first sent me your message, I was immediately drawn to you. And I started reading your blog this morning. And every morning I tend to, every morning I'm recording a podcast episode, I tend to pray to God to kind of get some guidance on where I want the conversation to go and what is the purpose with the episode and like what kind of people am I supposed to reach and how is this particular episode supposed to help people. And as I was reading your blog, it became abundantly clear what my goal with this episode is. And I wanted to share that with you. So the thing that immediately came to me is the similarities that I recognize with your story and my grandma's story. Because my grandma, she grew up...
Because I'm the same age as your grandma, right?
Well, I don't want to assume, but my grandma turned 80 this year.
Well, yeah, I'm not too far off because I'm turning 72.
Got you. Yeah. She's turning...
Hey, that's pretty close.
Yeah. And so her father was a soldier fighting the Germans in Norway, in Narvik. I don't know if you know where that is, but they were fighting the Germans. So when he came home from the war, he never talked about it ever again. It was never spoken about. When he came home, whatever was never happened. And that has been for me, it's been such a loss because I have so many questions. Granted, my curious nature into wanting to understand where people are coming from. And since he had such a huge trauma wound and never talked about it, I never really understood why my grandma was the way that she was. And when I read your blog, I saw so many similarities. And I would love for you to share with my listeners your story.
And you know what my next project is? Do you?
You're writing a book about intergenerational trauma.
Right. Okay. You do know. Okay.
Yeah. I saw that. And I'm so curious. I'm definitely going to read that book. There's no doubt about it. It's something I'm super curious about. So, Willie, if you may, can you share with my listeners a little bit about who you are and your background and why you're here today?
Yes, I can do that. I'm happy to share my background. My parents were both Holocaust survivors. My father was from Poland. He was in 7 concentration camps. He had a young family that were murdered. And my mother was a teenager. She's she was 12 years younger than my father in Romania, and her family and the whole Jewish community in that region of Romania was deported in 1941 to a very barren region in Ukraine called Transnistria. And they were put into ghettos, which really not much different than concentration camps, with no food, no shelter, no winter clothing, and a lot of people died of disease, and it was not nice. And following the war, they both immigrated separately in different years to Israel or Palestine because my mother arrived first. It was not Israel yet. It was still a British mandate, and they met there and got married, and 5, 6 years later they moved to Canada. So I was born in Toronto. Um, and so just a little bit about my childhood. So my parents were both um, severely traumatized by their experience, and every Holocaust survivor has experienced trauma. And and of course, they came to the country with nothing. They didn't know the language. They didn't even have um, any work skills or anything like that. But they sort of scraped together, and believe it or not, within a year of coming here, they actually bought a house. And so my parents worked a lot. I had an older sister, I have an older sister and younger brother, and we were left alone a lot. I mean, my parents, they were very loving, almost smothering, but also kind of very detached and distant.
Mm.
And so we were very much left on our own. Uh, they they were focused on providing basic necessities, food, clothing, housing. Was not much in the way of emotional support. Um, and so I grew up kind of like in survival mode. I had to do everything for myself. If you had a problem at school, I was on my own. Um, no one to help me with homework. You want to play sports, you take yourself to sports. There's
Mm.
no one taking you, and that was my life. And sort of, you kind of grow up a little on the. You grow up. You have to grow up very quickly. I grew up a little insecure, and kind of distrustful of others. I developed this very kind of almost like a brick wall around myself to protect myself. Part of it that is also inherited, and we get into intergenerational trauma. I mean,
Right.
my father was much worse than my mother suffered a lot from depression. I think that was sort of the predominant and a real obsession around food because she was a young teen and starving. And my father, he was very traumatized. If you asked him about his experience during the war, he would get very emotional and start to cry. And so you learn not to even ask.
Mm.
So um, over time, really, I didn't really know much about their history. But that's kind of the environment that I was raised in, and I kind of I functioned well for many, many years, but I never let people get close to me. I had a lot of issues that I didn't think I had issues, but I had a lot of issues,
Right.
and that was kind of like the trauma working itself, and I sort of you develop this kind of balance in your life. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And so develop a bunch of coping skills. So fast forward, my parents, they passed away in 2008 and 11. And in fact, my memoir starts in 2008 when my father passed away.
Mm.
And I guess as time went on, my wife started saying, you should You should write your family story. And I'm going, oh, I don't know. There's so many Holocaust books out there. And I said, in fact, I don't even really know their full story. My father, when I say he didn't talk about his experience, he didn't even talk about his experience before the war. I did not know, he lost siblings. I didn't even know their names. I know he had five siblings. No, he had six siblings, and two perished and four survived. And of course, I knew the name of his surviving siblings, but not the dead ones.
Mm.
And I remember one day I sat down to write a blog post of my parents' story. It was only 1,800 words. That's all I knew. And so I started doing some research because I wanted to know, and I'm going. And then I decided, as I said, as I got more and more into it and started digging deeper, deeper, I got sucked right in. And I decided I was going to write it because I wanted to learn about my ancestors. And I figured if I don't know, then who in the family knows? Nobody knows. And I said, and I had two young grandchildren. So I thought, well, they will know where they came from. I began doing research. I found archives, databases, all kinds of stuff. And then I started listening to the interviews of survivors. And some of them came from the same camps as my father, from the same town and things like that. I just started learning more and more and more. And my mother, in fact, did an interview in 1995, which I actually never listened to until 3 years ago.
Oh, wow.
It just didn't even dawn on me to listen. And I wrote this book, and I started getting kind of flashbacks of episodes, stories that started coming to the surface that I had to add to the book.
Mm.
And with that was a release of a whole lot of trauma.
Right. How old
I
were
get
you when that happened?
How old was I? It was
Yeah,
like during the pandemic.
during the
Literally,
pandemic.
it's only like 4 years ago. A lot of people ask me, was it cathartic writing the book? No, it was totally triggering. And my mental health started spiraling. Reached the point where I actually had to go and get professional help.
Mm.
And I remember when I first sat down with this therapist, who I'm still seeing, and she says, "Why are you here?" And I'm going, and I told her two problems. One is they were not the real problems, but what did I know? I told two problems. One is that I can't write anymore. I kind of was, I think I had so much anxiety that I just couldn't focus and write anymore. The other was, which I thought was a bigger problem, was that the book was going to be coming out in the next year or so. And I said I was terrified people are going to read this stuff because I personalized it, made it into a memoir. And now I was worried about people reading it. And then I would have to stand up in front of people and talk about it like I'm doing right now. I could not have done this 2 years ago, and she started digging in. And then even with her, at one point started complaining, you talk about all these people, you never talk about yourself. I should say, and I'm going to step back now and going, the title of the book is Out from the Shadows,
I like
because
that.
the Holocaust was a big shadow that hung over my family, not just my family, but other families as well.
Of course.
And personally, myself, how it impacted me is I was very comfortable not being in the spotlight. What the therapist did was help me being able to deal with being in the spotlight and out of the shadows.
I'm sure there are so many people like yourself who had parents who came from war. And a lot of these children never really had an avenue to talk about things because that wasn't
No,
the norm at home. And
right?
therefore, these are grandparents or great grandparents today who have had their own children, who has their own children's children, evidently, right? So I'm also curious, what did it look like for you when you started having your own children? What trauma did you bring with you? On the
I
counter
really,
side, what did you actively not bring with you into the parenting?
well, it's an interesting question. I wasn't aware of my own intergenerational trauma at the time. What I was really cognitive was my father's trauma. And I was really focused on not being the same kind of father as my dad was.
What did
I
that look
guess
like?
what I look like?
No,
So
so when
my
you say that you didn't want to be the kind of father that he was, like, what did it look like to be a father like he was, and what did it then look like for you?
if you had food on your plate and you had clothes to wear, he's done his job. That's not just people who have experienced trauma. That was kind of a mindset, people coming out of the depression. But it was much more extreme than that because he had a lot of other hang-ups. He had issues with anger. He had very strong distrust issues, other sort of very weird idiosyncrasies. And I didn't want to be anything like that.
Right.
And so as a father, I was always there, present. I always provided a lot of support. I still do. I do it with my grandchildren.
Yeah.
And so I'm very, very, very involved. You know, my daughter, my grandsons, they come to me when they have a problem because they know I will listen, I will not judge, I will help them work their way through it, things like that. My father wasn't anything like that,
Hmm.
or my mother. They were incapable of doing that. They were struggling themselves. And so they weren't capable of providing that kind of support. But you're right. Your point is growing up. I knew other children whose parents were Holocaust survivors. Did we ever talk about our youth, and our parents and the war? Never. Not one word was ever spoken.
Hmm.
It was something nobody was comfortable talking about.
Right. I wonder, I had a thought actually when I read your blog, because you also wrote that a lot of people didn't have that many people to look up to because they didn't necessarily have grandparents or aunts and uncles, because they were like you in your
And
own
nobody had
words.
very few have grandparents.
Exactly, right, because a lot
Some
of
survived, but most did not.
exactly. You were communicating on your blog. As siblings, you tend to have conflicts, and I almost wonder if it is something in the lines of looking at it's almost a mirror of yourself in a sense that you have another person who has shares the same trauma but also isn't really doing anything about it, so you kind of see yourself and the worst parts of yourself and judge it, and therefore there's that relationship that becomes tender and fragile and hurtful almost. I wonder if you can relate to that at all, or if you can share in your words when you're saying that sibling relationships were difficult.
It's interesting because I observed this when I was interviewing other descendants of Holocaust survivors. And I found that it was relatively common, and I wasn't sure if that was the norm, right? Reflected general population or not. So I reached out to this gerontologist who spent her career treating Holocaust survivors and their descendants. And she says, oh yeah, definitely. It's much more prevalent. She said that, how do you learn how to get along with siblings? Well, your parents and your aunts and uncles are role models. If there are very few surviving relatives, you don't see what a healthy relationship looks like.
Right.
And then layer on top of that, the children all have inherited a certain amount of trauma,
Mm.
experience their own, and it manifests itself very differently. That it's not surprising that relationships between siblings aren't that strong. And in my family, they're not. I can tell you, for example, for many years, my brother and my sister would say, what a horrible childhood we had. And I said, I didn't think so. And my brother would always criticize me and say I was in denial. And I said, and I thought he was nuts. He's exaggerating, and I have a different viewpoint today. In that, in fact, was I in denial? No, I didn't recognize it. I wasn't in denial. I did not recognize it. Remember, I buried all my trauma
Right.
and deep inside of it. And that's how I managed. That's how I coped. That's how I functioned. And I wasn't even aware that I had done that until I wrote a memoir and it all came out.
Right.
And so now I totally understand. And yes, my parents had a lot of shortcomings, but they also did the best they could with what they had. You have to sort of make do with what you're given.
So, if you were to give advice to someone who might be in the same situation, because here's the thing, I've often heard from adults that don't think that you can ever change anyone. And I agree that you can't necessarily change someone, but you can influence in a way that you can provide some tools in an avenue that might actually help them to start to think in a way that will allow them to trigger thoughts and start a process in which they might actually go on to their own healing journey, no matter what age they are. And I have that hope for any generation, and especially for people in my grandma's generation. So if you were to offer some advice onto how to utilize some tools into begin that journey of recognizing that your upbringing wasn't necessarily up to par with what the ideal is today, and it is okay to look back and recognize that that was true, but also allow yourself to heal from it.
Okay, so it takes a lot of things. One thing is you have to be very good at introspection. I would have things come up, and especially, with my therapist, and I would spend all entire week processing it and come back
Right.
the following week. And so you need that ability to really look look deep inside of you. And it's something that I kind of developed because I was kind of pushed in that direction. What are you
Right.
feeling? What does that make you feel like? And I think those are the kind of questions therapists ask you, and at first you think they're really dumb, but they're not. So first you have to identify what's really the root problem. You can't be looking at the symptoms, which is you're angry or you're depressed or you have a lot of anxiety, or situations trigger you and you go and you have a meltdown. That's fine. That basically tells you have a problem. But why? What's the source? Sometimes you can kind of work that out on yourself, but sometimes you need help. First thing, you need to talk about it.
You need to
And
talk about
and
it.
if you just hold it inside, you're not going to move forward.
Right. That's true with our thoughts, our emotions, whatever we are dealing with, whatever expressions that we have taken in throughout our lives that we do not address is going to become storage in our mind and in our body, and it manifests.
Right. And
Right.
you just store it in your body.
I also know that not only does it manifest in the sense that you have anger issues or the way that you handle a conflict when you're triggered, because those are situations when we're often triggered in conflicts or in confrontations, but it manifests in body pain. I know a lot of people who have like neck pain or back pain or hip
Stress.
pain or
It's
knee.
from stress.
It's coming from everything you're carrying and not releasing. It's taking up space in your body and it's hurting, and it has to come out, and in one way or another it will. And if you don't address it, then your body is going to start hurting. I think a lot of people might recognize themselves in some of the things that you're sharing, and also recognizing their own body pain and knowing that they have yet to address a lot of these wounds that they have yet to heal.
Or they're even aware of. And so is opening up, whether it's to your spouse, and your siblings, your best friend, or a professional. The first step is talking about it. And the more you talk about it, the more that comes out, and the more that you realize what your issue is, and what the source is. Once you recognize where it's coming from, then you start to develop tools. A lot of the stuff you can't be healed from, but you can learn how to manage them.
That's a good point. That's a good way to phrase it.
If you suffer from PTSD, there's no cure for that. But you can learn how to manage that and manage your triggers so that instead of avoiding them, you recognize when you're being triggered and you have learned how to respond to it. So that's the important step.
On the next episode of Becoming Secure with Max Mindset, Willie and I will address topics such as anti-Semitism and the ongoing conflict in Gaza and Israel right now. So stay tuned for another episode. And as always, stay curious and get to know yourself better. If you want to learn more about Willie's story, check out his blog and his books in the description below. Happy learning!